everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today we're going to have a lesson in basic biomechanics. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. This is a term that people use out there all the time, and quite frankly, it's an idiotic term, and it's used to make something that's actually an inferior training modality sound hardcore, and it's not based on reality, and that's this whole concept of overloading a muscle by doing a partial range of motion with a heavier weight than you can lift, right? Different examples, doing 6-inch range of motion bench presses and calling it overloading your triceps because you're using 200 pounds more than your max, right? Same thing on above the knee rack pulls on the deadlift. They'll be like, well, you're overloading your upper back and your traps. And nothing could be further from the truth. And people need to understand the basic biomechanics of this. And I'm not saying this to be mean, I'm not saying this to be a dick. I'm saying this because people need to actually understand what's going on. And we use terms like overload. You need to understand the term progressive overload means that you are loading a muscle harder, that you're working it harder. And I want, before we even go into the physics of it at all, or the muscle fiber recruitment, I want people to stop and think about it for a minute. You know that a muscle can contract X amount of hard, right? That you can't magically make a muscle contract with your mind willfully more than what you can contract, right? It can do what it can do. So if you take a weight and you lift a weight that's pretty much your 1 rep max, that's the heaviest weight that those muscles, that's as much force as your muscles can contract, right? That's as much as you can voluntarily contract. Same thing when you reach muscle failure. When you reach muscle failure, if you truly hit failure, you getting a little more psyched up doesn't make the muscle be able to contract harder necessarily. Once it's failed, it's failed. Now, there can be a psychological component that can help you get to that state, but that's what you're dealing with. So you can produce a certain amount of force. So let me put this in perspective. If you can lift more weight by shortening the range of motion, is it possible that you made the muscle contract any harder? Common sense should tell you no, because a maximum exertion is a maximum exertion. You've either hit muscle failure on reps, or you have hit your absolute max on how much force you can produce. So common sense should tell you immediately, maybe it's easier, right? Maybe it's easier, and therefore that's why you can lift the heavier weight. So if it's easier, you aren't overloading shit. What you're overloading is your joints, not your muscles. So if anything, when people say the terms like, oh, work the muscles, not the joints, I think that's a bad idea. I think the joints do need to be worked. I don't agree with that term, but if you want to talk about overloading the joints more than the muscles, do heavy lockouts with 200 or 300 pounds more than your 1 rep max. There you go, you're overloading joints now. And this idea comes from the equipped powerlifting world. And I can tell you right now, most raw powerlifting coaches will tell you it doesn't transfer. Most bodybuilding experts will tell you it doesn't even produce equal hypertrophy in many cases. So oftentimes it's an inferior hypertrophy stimulation, and that's what some PhDs in the field. PhD is in the field of exercise science, and people who specialize in muscle growth and hypertrophy will often tell you actually the data suggests a lot of these heavy partials produce less muscle growth, even though they feel more intense. Yeah, because your nervous system senses that you've got a heavier weight than it can lift. Your joints and your bones and everything are being loaded heavier, right? The muscles aren't working harder. In some cases, they're working less, and let's explain why. On your triceps is a perfect example. Like any other muscle, your triceps have a full range of motion. You do know when you're at the bottom, if you look at the levers and the moment arms, right? Just like if you think of a lever, at different points in a lever, you're stronger or weaker on it with the same amount of, the amount of weight you can lift, right? You guys know this from using a car jack. Should be some basic physics kicking in at this point. That if you change the angle of the lever sometimes, it affects dramatically how much weight you can lift, right? You know that when you guys pry an object up. It's harder when you're at the bottom on the triceps, right? Because of the angle of the elbow. It's more difficult. In fact, your triceps actually get worked just as much at the bottom of a press as they do at the top. Let that sink in. with the same amount of weight sometimes. Maybe even they work easier at the top because it's easier up there. It's just that they're so fatigued from coming out of the bottom that they're running out of steam at the top, particularly near the final reps or on a 1 rep max. But like with a lot of other muscles, peak tension on the muscle is oftentimes put when it's in a position to where it's at its disadvantage. Tricep is at a disadvantage down here. That means it has to work harder to straighten the elbow. It has to work harder down there. So actually, if your 1 rep max is 200 pounds, your tricep is having to work as hard as possible near the bottom with that 200 pounds. It's to work really hard because it's at a disadvantaged position. It has to recruit a lot of muscle fibers to deal with the same weight. So as it comes up, it's easier with a heavier weight because it doesn't need as many muscle fibers to move it anymore because it's now got a leverage advantage. The tricep gets worked through the entire bench press. The tricep works through the entire overhead press. It gets worked through the entire incline bench. It gets worked through all of it. It bends the elbow. All right, guys, this is what the tricep does. Right? Bends the elbow. You do know it's working down here also, not just up here. But this stuff comes from Equip Powerlifting because they use bench shirts. These guys oftentimes bench 300 more pounds, in some cases more, a few rare exceptions. Few very rare exceptions. But 200 to 300 pounds more than what they can bench without a shirt is common. Why? Because it slingshots it out of the bottom of the lift. These guys have to get used to handling heavier weights at the top because they're going to have to hold that in their hands physically. They are going to have to lock that much weight one day. So it's a sport-specific thing with direct carryover to the shirted bench. But if you're doing it this way, you're missing a lot of the training at the bottom. And you know, that's where a lot of the hypertrophy potential is. If anything, partials are a sport-specific carryover exercise that doesn't carry over to the full range of motion that actually induce inferior hypertrophy. And they're harder to recover from. So if a person's goal was to increase maximum jactitude, that would be a real stupid thing to do, wouldn't it? You're getting sometimes a few percent less muscle fiber stimulation because it's easier and you have certain muscle fibers that aren't being worked because you're not coming all the way down. Some of the muscle fibers in a muscle only work at certain joint angles, right? So you're possibly only getting, I don't know, maybe 97% of the possible muscle fiber recruitment, but it's twice as difficult to recover from. Right? Do you think that's the best way to get jacked? To create more fatigue that's harder to recover from with less muscle fiber recruitment? No, that's not the best way to gain muscle. In fact, I would say that's the worst way to gain muscle. That's pretty far down your list. Doesn't work very well. Well, that's what you're doing. Same thing with these rack pulls. Guys will say this silly ass shit like, well, because I can deadlift 400, but I can do these rack pulls above the knee with 650, right? Or whatever they're doing. Or some guys, they'll call it below the knee when they're like a half inch below their knee. It's supposed to be mid-shin, guys. That's a below the knee is things only a couple inches off the floor. Like a below the knee rack pull, the plates are like 3 inches from the floor, right? They're not way up in the air. Pro tip, I see a few of you guys doing that out there. But that's a specialized exercise. But back to the point. Yeah, it's easier. It's easier. That's why you can lift the heavier weight. You're moving at a shorter distance and you have a leverage advantage. People say, but the traps, they're getting that intense stretch. Do you not understand that the traps get worked at the bottom of a deadlift also? You do know the whole mid and lower trap actually have an enormous amount of isometric tension, and different fibers are even used through the traps that are used at the top at the lockout when you're further down at the bottom of a deadlift, because you have to pull your scapula back, right? When we deadlift, we don't slump our shoulders forward. We're pulled back in scapular retraction. All right, do you understand when you're doing a 3 rep max or a 5 rep max or a 1 rep max, a really heavy deadlift, do you understand when we're talking about, again, the muscle having to contract and the muscle having large amounts of muscle fibers recruited in an isometric position, that you're losing all that benefit from the bottom because to keep your scapula in retraction, pulling a deadlift off the floor, actually has an enormous amount of recruitment through the trapezius. And it hits parts of the trapezius that don't get hit during just that top 4 inches, even with a heavier weight. So when you're doing these rack pulls, technically you're losing a lot of potential stimulus in the trapezius, even isometric contraction, which is not the best way to grow. Stretching a muscle and isometric contraction are actually not the best stimulators of hypertrophy. They aren't. They can stimulate some growth, but they're not the best way to do it. Before guys say, oh, these new strongmen all have it. Strongmen do tons of overhead pressing, rowing, deadlifting, and they all use shitloads of drugs. I'm going to say that that's probably a big reason why they all have jack traps. Not just the farmer's walks. I'm not saying the farmer's walks don't help, but let's be honest here. It's the steroids, the overhead press. The overhead press is an amazing trap builder, by the way. Standing presses. Cleans, they do tons of those. Cleans build traps. Deadlifts, row, all these exercises they do build traps. It's not just the farmer's walks. Steroids build traps even without training, by the way. And most strongmen use steroids. So, let that sink in too. There's your magic secret. Farmer's walks aren't necessarily what's doing it. They're contributing, but they're certainly not the primary factor here. They're not the primary factor. So actually, you're not even overloading the traps by taking your 400-pound deadlift up to a 650, because that 400 off the floor requires an enormous amount of isometric contraction to keep the scapula pulled together, right? So there's parts of the trap you're no longer working as effectively. So if you're trying to build the traps as big as possible, and you're trying to use some sort of deadlift variation to do it, you really need a longer range of motion, right? Then you'll work more planes and angles in the traps, and you'll get more muscle fibers in the traps recruited. Yeah, you're forced to use a slightly lighter weight. Yeah, when you do deficits or snatch grip or any of that. But you guys get the idea. That lower angle actually has its own trapezius stimulation. You're removing it. You're taking out one of the entire functions of the trapezius that would normally be there in a deadlift just to focus on a different element of it at the top. And you think that's the best way to make your traps grow? You're overloading the traps? No, you're not. You're reducing potential stimulation of the traps. This is bullshit. It's all bullshit. Muscle hypertrophy is best obtained by training muscles through the longest effective range of motion possible with the greatest workloads that they can tolerate, and then recovering from it, right? That's how you stimulate muscle growth, not by doing goof off, jerk off, partial ego lifts through 4 and 6 inch ranges of motion. Is any of this sinking in for you guys yet? You're not overloading shit. You're actually, in many cases, reducing the load, but calling it overload because you got more weight on the bar. But the muscles aren't working harder. In some cases, they're working less. In the best cases, they're getting equal stimulus, in a best case scenario. But they're sure as hell not getting more. All right, this nonsense needs to go. This term is bullshit. It's complete bullshit in this case. It's just ego lift. Just call it what it is. It's ego lifting, guys. All right, guys, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.